Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 12 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 12. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, as I'll talk about each individual player, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, while also presenting statistics in order to justify those overall rankings. Before we begin, a couple reminders. If you're looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description. While you're down there, of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel because we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season. Tomorrow morning, I'll be live streaming at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time before the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions game. So for about 2.5 hours, I'll be live streaming, answering questions. I'll have rankings on screen. So for those of you who have any questions in terms of setting your lineup, be sure to swing on by. Now, the final announcement I wanted to make, similar to yesterday, is in regards to the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel. Like I mentioned yesterday, all hoodies on the website, AndrewKirchhoffShop.com. Link can be found down in the description of the video, are 25% off until next Monday. As soon as you add the product into your cart, the 25% discount is immediately applied to all hoodies. I greatly appreciate all the support you guys have shown in regards to the merchandise thus far this season. So if you have not yet already, be sure to take advantage of the Thanksgiving sale of 25% off until Monday. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about the wide receiver position in terms of matchups. 2023 wide receiver receiving statistics allowed. Like I've talked about, I've adjusted the spectrum of time from weeks 5 through 11, so the last 7 weeks in terms of wide receiver statistics allowed. In that overall conversation, the best matchup going forward is the Philadelphia Eagles, as they're allowing over 37 half PPR fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers based on receiving statistics isolated, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. Of course, followed by that, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, New York Giants, Washington Commanders, Arizona Cardinals. So wide receivers like Stefon Diggs taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, fantastic matchup. Michael Pittman Jr. taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We have, CeeDee Lamb, who is already playing well and has an opportunity of taking on the Washington Commanders secondary, and even Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, if he plays, taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Obviously, we want to take advantage of these advantageous matchups, but on the other end of the spectrum, we have some of the more difficult matchups like the New York Jets, the Denver Broncos, the Indianapolis Colts, Dallas Cowboys. Again, in a lot of these scenarios, you are going to have to start your studs. Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle, they're taking on the Jets. It doesn't matter. You got to fire them up. Either way, I just wanted to go ahead and represent all these statistics on screen. I'll refer back to them over the course of today's video. Let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for Week 12. A couple reminders. Do not forget that rankings are always subject to change. Prior to tomorrow morning, my rankings could change. Prior to, of course, Sunday morning's live stream, my rankings could change. So if you want to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you're going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR. It includes flex rankings, all-encompassing rankings every single Sunday for that individual week. And considering tomorrow, there are 3 games. I'm going to also go ahead and send those tomorrow morning. So for those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy, use code Andrew, make that first time deposit, determine your eligibility based on your location on the right side of the screen, and take advantage of this opportunity of helping me help you for the remainder of the season. And if you go ahead and sign up before tomorrow's Thursday game between the San Francisco 49ers and Seattle Seahawks, you can take advantage of the new customer special of 0.5 total yards from Christian McCaffrey. Thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about our top 40 wide receivers. Beginning with our number 1, we have CeeDee Lamb. Like I mentioned just moments ago, they are taking on the 4th best matchup at the wide receiver position, taking on the Washington Commanders, who are allowing nearly 33 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. My expectation for a wide receiver that over the course of the last 4 weeks has been the number 1 wide receiver for fantasy football, he's going to have himself another incredible game. He has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games. And in the matchup against the Washington Commanders, just last week, Tommy DeVito had 3 passing touchdowns. Not only that, Darius Slayton had himself 4 catches, 82 and a touchdown. If a wide receiver of that caliber can dominate against that defense, I can only imagine what CeeDee Lamb is going to be capable of doing this week. Moving on to our number 2, we have Tyreek Hill. Of course, Tyreek Hill has played well all season long. Last week had 25.6 fantasy points while only playing 59% of the offensive snaps. At one point of the game, he left due to a hand injury. He did end up returning and having himself a great overall performance, but typically he plays about 72 to 75% of the offensive snaps every single week. So it was a little bit of a surprise to see a little bit of a dip there, but nonetheless, still scored a boatload of fantasy points. Thus far this season, he has had 100 plus receiving yards in 6 of the last 10 games in which he has participated in. Even though he takes on the New York Jets and it is the most difficult matchup at the wide receiver position, he is a stud and we expect him to, of course, score a high volume of fantasy points for us. Moving on to our number 3, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra, speaking of getting 100 yards on multiple occasions, he continues to, of course, achieve that or score a touchdown every single week. Thus far this season, there has not been a singular week in which Amon-Ra St. Brown has not had at least 100 receiving yards or a touchdown within his score line. He continues to put up incredible performances. They take on the Green Bay Packers tomorrow morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, before that, we'll be live streaming. Keep that in mind. The Packers secondary is in shambles. They've been dealing with a lot of injuries, and considering it's a short week and a Thursday game in the morning, there's a high likelihood the guys like Jair Alexander or some of their other cornerbacks that were hurt last week, Rudy Ford, are most likely not going to be available. With that being the case, I do anticipate Amon-Ra dominating, especially considering last week, a slot receiving option like Keenan Allen just went for 116, 10 catches and a touchdown. I'm expecting something similar from Amon-Ra St. Brown. Moving on to our number 4, we have A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown had himself one of his most disappointing performances as an Eagle. Last year, he did have a similar performance in which he had 1 catch for 7 yards. This last week on Monday Night Football, 1 catch for 8 yards. The weather was definitely an impact play, but there were opportunities there for A.J. Brown to be a successful fantasy stud. Unfortunately, Jalen Hurts just wasn't as accurate as he, probably would have wanted to be. There was a post play in which he was wide open. He had beat his defender, but unfortunately, Jalen Hurts threw it significantly behind A.J. Brown and it was intercepted. Nonetheless, A.J. Brown's going to get back on track considering he has seen this in the past. Earlier this season, weeks 1 and 2, when he didn't see the ball very much, he complained. He got himself 10 plus targets for the remainder of the season. So my expectation is that he'll probably pout, and as he should, he'll probably ask for the ball every single down. And he'll probably get himself 10 plus targets and have himself a great game against the Buffalo Bills secondary that, of course, has been struggling thus far this season. You got to remember, A.J. Brown in 6 of the last 7 games has been able to surpass 7 plus receptions. So getting a week of 1 reception is very uncommon. I expect him to bounce back this week. Our number 5 for this week is Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen's coming off another incredible performance. 16 targets, 10 catches, 116 and a touchdown, nearly 23 fantasy points. Just to put this in perspective, Keenan Allen thus far this season is on pace in a 16-game season, okay? I've adjusted the parameters, not to a 17-game season, because I want to compare him to, the Keenan Allen of the past. He is on pace this season for 181 targets, 133 receptions, 1,618 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns in just 16 games. He's a 31-year-old wide receiver who may score over 300 fantasy points in a half PPR this season. He honestly is probably going to accomplish that. He is unbelievable, playing out of his mind. Age is just a number. We're going to continue to fire him up as the number 1 receiving option, and honestly, the only receiving option of the Los Angeles Chargers offense. Our number 6 this week, we have Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs had himself another lackluster performance. Of course, this offense was able to get back on track as a whole. Now, I will say it was a difficult matchup taking on the New York Jets, but this is back-to-back weeks in which we have seen less than 7 fantasy points on multiple occasions. Now, if you guys remember last season, for those of you who had Stefon Diggs on roster as well, from weeks 14 through 16, he had himself a very similar kind of stint of time in which he wasn't playing well. Throughout that span of time, 2022, weeks 14 through 16, fantasy football playoff implications, he only had 5.2, 8.2, and 3.6 fantasy points in those 3 different performances. Luckily, this week, he has an opportunity taking on the best matchup at the wide receiver position, the Philadelphia Eagles, to have himself a bounce-back performance. That's what we're going to anticipate to see, especially considering how great the Philadelphia Eagles have been in terms of stopping the run. Moving on to our number 7, we have Tank Dell, the rookie wide receiver that is playing out of his mind. Tank Dell, over the course of the last 3 games, is the number 3 overall fantasy wide receiver. Not only in terms of points per game, but in terms of total fantasy points as well. He has had himself 35 total targets in the last 3 games that have led to 4 receiving touchdowns. What more can we ask for? He takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Of course, we all know that the Jacksonville Jaguars have an elite run-stop defense, but on the back end, they really can't stop the pass. Therefore, we're anticipating another performance out of Tank Dell in which he had earlier this season against the Jacksonville Jaguars. In that game, week 3, against Jacksonville, 5 catches, 145 and a touchdown for 23 fantasy points. Let's continue the streak of success for the rookie wide receiver. Moving on to our number 8, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore with Justin Fields is a completely different wide receiver. And we mentioned that, the last couple weeks when we thought potentially Justin Fields could return in regards to the comparison of Justin Fields and Tyson Bagent as the starting quarterback of the Bears offense. Over the course of the last 5 games with Justin Fields, DJ Moore has been able to surpass 96 receiving yards in 4 of the last 5 games, coming off a performance most recently of 7 catches, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 19.1 fantasy points against the Detroit Lions secondary. If you go ahead and exclude the 45-point fantasy game in which DJ Moore had with Justin Fields against the Washington Commanders, he's still averaging 16.8 fantasy points per game with Justin Fields this season. My expectation here is another big performance for DJ Moore. Our number 9 and our number 10 for this week are Rams wide receivers. But let's first and foremost, let's talk about Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua sits at our number 9 primarily because if in fact we're going to be in a position in which Cooper Kupp is not available to play, well, in the last 4 games without Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua is averaging 13 targets, 10 catches, 125 receiving yards, and scoring 1 receiving touchdown every 4 games, averaging 19.0 half PPR fantasy points per game in the 4 games without Cooper Kupp. Earlier this week, Sean McVay, the head coach of the Los Angeles Rams, said that Cooper Kupp is day-to-day. He may end up playing. He's going to try his very best. We're going to have to wait and see. If, in fact, Cooper Kupp does play, I still expect Puka Nacua to be a top 12 wide receiver option at this current moment in time. If, in fact, we get into a position in which Cooper Kupp is out once again, I would move up Puka Nacua 1 to 2 overall rankings within the given week. Either way, you know that you're starting him against the Arizona Cardinals, the 5th best matchup at the position. Now, speaking of Cooper Kupp, like I just mentioned, in regards to his potential recovery, this is 4 consecutive weeks now in which Cooper Kupp has had less than 6 fantasy points. And never could I have ever imagined that that would be the circumstance in 2023. But this is the situation. This is the reality of the situation. Going into this week, if in fact he has a full participation of practice by Friday, we'll know for sure that he is going to play. He may end up getting a limited participation. That may not go ahead and automatically give him a chance to play on Sunday, but he's going to honestly try his best. Taking on the Arizona Cardinals, it is an advantageous matchup, and if Cooper Kupp is active, it's very difficult for me to sit him in any sort of circumstance, just like any of the other stud wide receivers in fantasy football. Moving on to our number 11, we have Mike Evans taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Mike Evans thus far this season has been incredible. I mean, every single week he's either scoring a touchdown or is consistently getting over 10 fantasy points when he is healthy within this offense. Last week against the San Francisco 49ers, it wasn't an easy matchup, yet he very easily could have had himself an opportunity of scoring a second touchdown. He tried to make a couple acrobatic catches. There could be a conversation in terms of defensive pass interference. Either way, Mike Evans had himself still 12 targets, 5 catches, 43 and a touchdown. Scored an early touchdown in that game in the red zone. That's all you can ask for. As long as they continue to send him opportunities in the red zone, now has an easier matchup, even though the Indianapolis Colts secondary has played far better over the course of the last couple months. I do anticipate Mike Evans, Chris Godwin to have himself a lot of success within the given week. Moving on to our number 12, we have Davante Adams. Davante Adams was able to make a huge play to make his entire week, a big touchdown down the middle of the field. Many people could argue that there was an offensive pass interference, a little bit of a push-off. I don't care. I'm always for the side of the offense. I'm trying to see fantasy points scored. So as long as we continue to see another consecutive game, because the last 2 games we have seen Aiden O'Connell target Davante Adams 13 times each. If we can continue to see that elite level of opportunity, I mean, that's all we could really ask for, especially considering he's a young quarterback. Yes, he has one of the best wide receivers at his disposal, but as long as he continues to give him opportunity, that's really all that we can ask for. They do take on the Kansas City Chiefs. It's not an easy matchup, to say the very least, but nonetheless, we're hoping for the best for Davante Adams. Moving on to our number 13 to begin the C tier, we have Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr. has been incredible this season. In the last 6 games in which he has played with Gardner Minshew as a starting quarterback, averaging 10.5 targets, 7.2 receptions, 76 receiving yards per game, scoring a touchdown 1 out of every 3 games, averaging 13.28 half PPR fantasy points per game. Thus far this season with Gardner Minshew as a starting quarterback, he has not once scored less than 10 fantasy points within a given week. Michael Pittman Jr. has the second best matchup at the position, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, also coming off of a bye week. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are nearly allowing 37 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers since week 5. My expectation is a big performance here for the number 1 wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts. Number 14 is Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk has had 3 consecutive games of over 13 fantasy points. He is putting up great performances, coming off a huge week in which he had 5 catches, 156 and a touchdown. Of course, making that huge play down the sideline in which the opposing, secondary defender fell down trying to make a play. Nonetheless, Brandon Aiyuk continues to play well. The only issue that I have with Brandon Aiyuk is that he doesn't get as much opportunity. And like I mentioned yesterday, in regards to Christian McCaffrey has had in the last 3 weeks 17 receptions. He has had more receptions than Brandon Aiyuk. In the last 6 games consecutively, Brandon Aiyuk has either had 5 or fewer receptions. That in itself is not great, especially as the number 1 receiving option of this offense. Nonetheless, Brandon Aiyuk taking on the Seattle Seahawks, I expect him to continue to find success as this offense for the San Francisco 49ers continues to put out great performances. On number 15, on the other side of this overall matchup, we have DK Metcalf taking on the San Francisco 49ers. If you guys remember the NFL playoffs 2022/2023, the wild card round last season, San Francisco 49ers taking on the Seattle Seahawks. In that overall game, DK Metcalf, 13 targets, 10 catches, 136, 2 touchdowns, scored over 30 fantasy points against the division rival in the San Francisco 49ers in the playoffs. Now, the question is, can we get another similar performance out of DK Metcalf that is somewhat reminiscent of that game? I don't know we're going to get close to 30 points, but as long as we can secure very similar performances that we have seen in the last 2 weeks, the last 2 games consisting of 13.3 and 17.9, 4 of the last 5 games in which, of course, DK Metcalf has participated healthy in, he's been able to get himself over 9 targets. The opportunities are there. The production has been there as of late. The matchup, honestly, I expect him to play well. It's just a matter of, can Geno Smith elevate his production? We're in a situation where Geno Smith is dealing with that tricep injury. If that is going to bother him, that certainly will make a difference. But at the end of the game last week against the LA Rams, Geno Smith said, you know what? F it. I'm going in the game. He took over. He threw the ball down the middle of the field straight to DK Metcalf immediately. Luckily, as a Rams fan, the kicker pushed it a little bit to the right, and we'll take that. But nonetheless, DK Metcalf, a solid player as our number 15. Number 16 for this week is the Slim Reaper. We have DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith, again, in the last 6 games that he has played without Dallas Goedert within the lineup, going back to 2022 and this season, in the last 6 games without Dallas Goedert, 8.3 targets per game, 5.2 receptions, 87 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown 1 out of every 3 games, 13.23 fantasy points per game. He's coming off of a week in which he had 6 catches for 99 receiving yards against the Kansas City Chiefs defense. Now has the privilege of taking on the Buffalo Bills defense. This should be an exciting matchup, and hopefully we could get a back and forth matchup where it's relatively high scoring between these 2 teams. And if that's going to be the case, in the absence of Dallas Goedert, we should end up seeing a lot of opportunities for DeVonta Smith, especially considering, A.J. Brown on the opposite side of the field is going to be pulling so much attention, getting himself double-digit targets within the given week, considering he's likely going to be complaining for all of this week until he gets those double-digit targets. Number 17, we have Chris Olave. This week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons, a division rival. It's a solid matchup overall. I do expect Chris Olave to put up a great performance, especially considering how much damage he did against that defense last season. Thus far this season, he's been averaging 11.17 fantasy points per game. And the question regarding the entire New Orleans Saints organization is who's going to be the starting quarterback this week? Is it going to be Derek Carr? Is he still in the concussion protocol? Or will it be Jameis Winston? Regardless of who it ends up being, he's going to find success. Last week, in the second half of that game with Jameis Winston, was a dominant force. The weeks prior, there's a reason why Chris Olave has 51 targets in the last 5 games. Regardless of who's at the quarterback position, he is the primary number 1 of this offense. And considering Michael Thomas is now on the injured reserve, they're going to continue to send the ball in the direction of Chris Olave. Our number 18 for this week is Calvin Ridley. I'm just going to hope that Calvin Ridley's inconsistencies are behind him. I'm just going to hope. The amount of belief I had in Calvin Ridley before the season started was incredibly high. And thus far this season, he has been a disappointment, as we all have seen. But in the last 4 games in which Zay Jones has been active, there's been a true difference made in regards to the overall upside of Calvin Ridley. In the last 4 games with Zay Jones active, not only is Calvin Ridley getting himself a base minimum of 8 targets per game plus, but he's also averaging 17.25 fantasy points per game when Zay Jones is in the lineup, coming off a performance of 7 catches, 103, 2 touchdowns, 27.6 fantasy points. He was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy. And thus far this season, amongst all receiving options on the Jacksonville Jaguars, he continues to lead in the conversation of total red zone opportunities. Thus far this season, he has twice as many red zone targets than Christian Kirk within this offense. He has 10 targets, while Christian Kirk in the red zone only has 5 targets. Last week, both of his receiving touchdowns within the red zone. As long as that continues to be a part of this offense, and Calvin Ridley is given that opportunity because of the return of Zay Jones, opening up more opportunities for him on the opposite side of the field. So I'm just going to hope that he can put together a great performance here against the Houston Texans. I have him in the middle of the pack of the wide receiver conversation because I don't want to overreact to last week's performance, and I don't want to get us burnt once again. Every other week, Calvin Ridley makes himself a great performance. Let's just hope that, we can get consecutive games of consistency going forward. Moving on to our number 19, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Ja'Marr Chase without Joe Burrow. I still expect him, considering how talented of a wide receiver he is, to put up a, pretty decent overall performance as a wide receiver 2 option. Anything more than that, he would need to have an unbelievable performance in which Jake Browning is the next coming at the quarterback position, which I don't expect that to be the case, but there's always the potential. I'm not going to put it past Ja'Marr Chase to be able to elevate the quarterback that he plays with. But going into this week, he purely just needs double-digit targets, and he needs opportunities down in the red zone. If they can go ahead and send the ball in his direction, like Ja'Marr Chase always says, he's always effing open. So if that's going to be the case, regardless of who plays a quarterback, hopefully he'll get the ball going in his direction on a consistent basis. Moving on to our number 20, we have Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle, as of late, has been very inconsistent as a wide receiver. In regards to his overall performances, we've experienced, 3 different Jaylen Waddles over the course of the last 6-7 weeks. He's either injured, he's either getting himself a boatload of opportunity and scoring a high volume of fantasy points, or he's putting together a very lackluster performance of 4 catches for 55 yards against the Las Vegas Raiders defense. This week, he takes on the most difficult matchup, a defense that is only allowing 12.73 fantasy points per game since week 5 to opposing wide receivers. If we're going to anticipate Tyreek Hill continuing to have himself great performances, that doesn't leave much to Jaylen Waddle. You would assume that the number 1 passing offense in the National Football League in terms of passing yards per game on average would be able to support more than one wide receiver within their offense on a consistent basis. They've not been able to establish that as of late. We're just going to hope that Jaylen Waddle finds the end zone within the given week or gets himself double-digit targets. Please, Tua, please throw him the ball. Moving on to our number 21. Speaking of getting double-digit targets, let's talk about Adam Thielen. With the offensive play calling changes, going back to Frank Reich last week, we saw a lot of opportunity go in the direction of Adam Thielen. 11 targets, 8 catches, 74 receiving yards. The only thing that he was missing from his overall scoreline was a touchdown. Tommy Tremble was the guy that got the red zone target that ended up scoring a touchdown in that overall conversation. Nonetheless, this is an offense that going into this week, taking on the Tennessee Titans, has an opportunity to put together a solid performance, primarily because this is probably the easiest matchup that they're going to have for the remainder of the season in regards to defenses. So considering the Tennessee Titans are allowing nearly 29 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the 11th best matchup at the position since week 5, it's just a matter of can Adam Thielen get a red zone target, score a touchdown, because outside of that, he's going to get himself 7, 8 potential catches, 70, 80 plus receiving yards within the given week, which really we can't complain with. Moving on to our number 22. We have Nico Collins, the number 2 receiving option of the Houston Texans offense in the absence of Noah Brown. Of course, had himself a solid performance, 11 targets, 7 catches, 65 receiving yards. If it wasn't for the fact that, unfortunately, CJ Stroud threw a couple interceptions within that game, we could have seen Nico Collins had himself a huge overall performance. He even had a target down in the end zone in which if it was thrown just 1 or 2 feet higher, because Nico Collins has a ridiculous vertical leap, he could have very easily came down with the ball. And unfortunately, it was interception within the end zone. Nonetheless, going forward, as long as this offense continues to be that pass-heavy attack, taking on a defense that loves to stop the run, my expectation is a pass-heavy approach from the Houston Texans offense, which leads to a lot of fantasy upside for Nico Collins. Our number 23 for this week, we have Zay Flowers. Considering Mark Andrews' absence, I do expect that Isaiah likely is going to fill in and get a majority of those overall targets that would typically have gone in Mark Andrews' direction. But when you take on the Los Angeles Chargers defense, you should be firing up all of your wide receivers. So hopefully we can get great production not only out of Zay Flowers, but Odell Beckham Jr. this week, assuming he's healthy. We'll talk about him in just a moment. But in regards to Zay Flowers, last week had a touchdown called back. It was a screen play. Odell Beckham Jr., unfortunately, was blocking a little bit too early down the field on a screen pass, led to an offensive pass interference. I mean, it was going to be a 60-yard receiving touchdown from Zay Flowers. You get the ball in his hands, he's an explosive player. And especially when you take on the Los Angeles Chargers secondary that has not played well all season long, since week 5, they have only had 2 great performances against opposing wide receivers. Against the Chicago Bears with Tyson Bagent at quarterback, and against the New York Jets with Zach Wilson at quarterback. Outside of those performances, when they've taken on Dallas, Kansas City, Detroit, or Green Bay, they have at base minimum allowed 175 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers and 1 receiving touchdown minimum per game in those 4 overall performances against those elite offenses with, solid wide receivers and, of course, solid quarterbacks. Therefore, my expectation this week is a huge performance out of Zay Flowers within the matchup. Number 24, we have Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel always will have the potential of a breakout performance, but he also doesn't get much opportunity within this offense. Unless they're going to give him those, handoffs, whether it's an end around or whether he's out of the backfield, getting himself a couple rushing attempts, it really is difficult to see him getting a high volume of overall target share, especially considering George Kittle. Christian McCaffrey in the last couple of weeks has been a receiving machine, 17 receptions in the last 3 games. Brandon Aiyuk, of course, is the number 1 outside wide receiver. So Deebo Samuel is kind of in a tricky spot where he's kind of the number 4 receiving option of this offense. That being said, the last time out against the Seattle Seahawks in the NFL playoffs, 2022/2023, had himself 9 targets, 6 catches, 133 and a touchdown, 3 rushing attempts for 32 rushing yards, and 25.5 fantasy points. We have seen big performances from Deebo Samuel against his division rivals in the Seattle Seahawks on multiple occasions over the years. It's just a matter of can Deebo Samuel get the high volume of opportunity he needs to claim a top 24 standing at the wide receiver position. I'm expecting this week for that to be the case. Moving on to our number 25, we have Diontae Johnson. He is still the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. That has never been in question since he has returned from his overall injury. Last week, it wasn't really much of a surprise considering they were taking on the Cleveland Browns, that everyone played poorly within that offense. And luckily, they have finally fired Matt Canada. Matt Canada, their former offensive coordinator. Hopefully, this is only going to help the passing game and only going to help Kenny Pickett, because thus far this season, Kenny Pickett has just as many passing touchdowns as Tommy DeVito does. And Tommy DeVito has only been starting for the last couple weeks. Just putting that into perspective, thus far this season, in 10 games, we have only seen Kenny Pickett complete 6 passing touchdowns. Hopefully, the offensive coordinator change is going to change everything, and is going to allow Diontae Johnson and this offense to take another step forward. They do take on the Cincinnati Bengals. That is the 10th best matchup at the position, allowing over 29.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're expecting the number 1 of the Pittsburgh Steelers to be a dominant force this week. Moving on to our number 26, we have Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk with Zay Jones, in the same vein in which we were talking about Calvin Ridley averaging over 17 fantasy points per game when Zay Jones is active. In that same situation, unfortunately, Christian Kirk is only averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game when Zay Jones is active. So that may be a coincidence. That may be, just something that going forward, if we're going to see Zay Jones take the field and Christian Kirk is going to see less overall offensive snaps, if in fact they lean away from 11 personnel sets, 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers, if that's going to be the case, then Christian Kirk's value overall will be lessened in that overall situation. We're hoping that's not going to be the case. Hopefully they run a lot of 11 personnel sets considering they have so many talented receiving options. And with that being the case, hopefully we'll get a lot of production and opportunity going in the direction of Christian Kirk this week against the Houston Texans, which in my mind should be an advantageous matchup in a pass-heavy script. Moving on to our number 27, we have Tyler Lockett. Hopefully, Tyler Lockett is at a full capacity of health. I know last week he was dealing with a hamstring injury. Still had himself 7 targets, 5 catches for 51. An underwhelming performance in his overall situation, primarily because we do typically expect Tyler Lockett to be, a touchdown or bust kind of guy. So going into this week, taking on the San Francisco 49ers, my expectation this week would be a very negative game script. Now, this is very similar to the last couple matchups, especially in 2022, in which the Seattle Seahawks took on the San Francisco 49ers. In those games, negative game script, we saw Tyler Lockett, 7 catches for 68 in their first overall contest, 9 catches for 107 in the second meeting throughout the 2022 regular season. So if we could potentially see a high total of overall passing attempts from Geno Smith, if he's healthy with that tricep injury, Tyler Lockett should be in solid overall play in a negative game script. Our number 28 for this week is Garrett Wilson. I don't know what to expect from Tim Boyle, but I know that at least Zach Wilson, for majority of the season, was able to elevate Garrett Wilson to being a solid wide receiver option. I mean, we had him ranked within the top 12 wide receivers on multiple occasions, considering he was getting, 12 plus targets for like 5 consecutive games, was able to get himself like 8 catches, 80 plus yards for 4 consecutive games. When you're able to have that kind of success within an offense, we're going to hope that going forward, regardless of the quarterback change, he's still going to find success because he's a very talented wide receiver. I mean, if we remember last season with Joe Flacco or Mike White, it doesn't matter. He had himself incredible production with those other quarterbacks compared to Zach Wilson. So maybe Tim Boyle can elevate him. Thus far throughout Tim Boyle's entire career, he is only known for having 2 starts as the Detroit Lion in 2021. In those games, 3 passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions. They do take on Miami in a short week. I mean, I'm just going to anticipate that Garrett Wilson has the potential of being a wide receiver too, but I don't know if he sees as high of a volume of targets than he did with Zach Wilson. We're going to hope that he does going forward. Moving on to our number 29, we have Terry McLaurin. They take on the Dallas Cowboys this week. Of course, that is a very difficult matchup. He will either be seeing a lot of Bland or Gilmore. Either way, those are really tough cornerback matchups to take on within a given week. Terry McLaurin last season, week 18 with Sam Howell against the Dallas Cowboys within that overall matchup, scored nearly 15 fantasy points, had himself a touchdown, a great overall performance. But this Dallas Cowboys secondary is a little bit different in comparison to last year. Again, Stefon Gilmore as their primary number 1 will probably be on the side of Terry McLaurin for majority of this game. Luckily, last season, when the Washington Commanders took on the Indianapolis Colts in 2022, Terry McLaurin in that game went for over 100 receiving yards, had himself a dominant performance against Stefon Gilmore. We're going to hope for very similar production within the given week. I do anticipate a negative game script and a lot of passing in the second half from the Washington Commanders. I mean, the Washington Commanders, in terms of pass rate, lead the National Football League amongst all 32 teams. So my expectation is a lot of passing and hopefully a lot of targets for Terry McLaurin. Our number 30 is Courtland Sutton. Now, Courtland Sutton has been one of the most consistent wide receivers for fantasy purposes. He has scored a touchdown in 8 of the last 10 games. He has scored a touchdown in the last 5 consecutive games, but they do take on the Cleveland Browns. Taking on Denzel Ward is no joke. It is a very difficult matchup. Hopefully, Russell Wilson can just throw the ball up in the red zone once again and find Courtland Sutton for another consecutive game of receiving touchdown. And if in fact that takes place, beautiful. We'll love it. But I will admit, this is not an easy matchup, and I do not expect much out of Courtland Sutton. Hopefully he can find a touchdown to, balance out his overall performance, which can get him potentially, 10, 11 fantasy points. But outside of that, it's going to be a tough week. Moving on to our number 31, we have Drake London. Of course, they're coming off of the bye. We have most recently heard that Desmond Ridder is going to be the starting quarterback of this team. With Desmond Ridder named the starter, if you go back to weeks 2 through 7 this season, with Desmond Ridder as the starting quarterback, Drake London was averaging 8 targets, 5 catches, 64 receiving yards, scoring a receiving touchdown once out of every 3 games and averaging 11.2 fantasy points per game. We're hoping for that similar level of production taking on the New Orleans Saints this week as the primary number 1 wide receiver of this offense. Moving on to our number 32, we have Marquise Brown. I would like to hope that Marquise Brown is not going to be ignored within this offense any longer, especially considering him and Kyler Murray have such a great connection last season and going back to college at Oklahoma. So if in fact you take on the LA Rams and the LA Rams are just going to run the ball, impose their will through the air against your defense, hopefully we'll be in a situation where with a negative game script and a lot of passing, the ball is not going to be only sent in the direction of Greg Dortch and Trey McBride. If we remember last season against this defense, with Kyler Murray, 17 targets, 14 receptions, 140 receiving yards against the LA Rams. Earlier this season, Marquise Brown against the LA Rams, 11 targets, 4 receptions, 34 receiving yards. Hopefully the quarterback change elevates Marquise Brown's overall production, but it's just a matter of can he get an ample volume of opportunity considering the last 2 weeks has only had himself a total of 9 targets. Moving on to our number 33 and our number 34, both of the wide receivers of the Green Bay Packers. Let's begin with Romeo Doubs. Romeo Doubs has scored a receiving touchdown in 4 of the last 5 games. In week 4 against the Detroit Lions, the last time he took on this team, 9 catches for 95 yards, 14.0 half PPR fantasy points. He's a consistent option, continues to play well, and scored the game-winning touchdown last week. I expect him to continue to put up 10-plus fantasy points going into this matchup. Now, Jayden Reed, on the other hand, of course, very similar to Romeo Doubs, has been scoring touchdowns as of late. Last week, had himself 3 rushing attempts for 46 rushing yards, scored himself a rushing touchdown while also getting himself 6 targets, 4 catches, 46 receiving yards. 17.2 fantasy points is no joke, but he's been able to score himself over 16 fantasy points in each of the last 2 games. In the last 5 games, Jayden Reed's averaging nearly 12 fantasy points per game. If he continues that overall streak of success, especially taking on the Detroit Lions, which is very difficult to run the ball on, with only A.J. Dillon in this backfield, I do expect a lot of passing, especially in the second half, in the direction of Romeo Doubs and Jayden Reed. Our number 35 for this week is DeAndre Hopkins. As you guys can see from the overall route chart, the overall opportunities he's being given aren't great. And hopefully the success of the running game from Derrick Henry is going to open up more play action and open up more opportunities for DeAndre Hopkins. But outside of a triple handoff, flea flicker, Hail Mary pass in the direction of DeAndre Hopkins that led to a touchdown, outside of that overall situation, we're not really finding much success and consistency out of DeAndre Hopkins within this offense. We had a lot of hope based on the first overall performance of Will Levis that maybe he could elevate this offense and DeAndre Hopkins to being a consistent option for fantasy purposes. But considering we're having to rely upon huge touchdowns down the field for ultimate success, this isn't something that I want to hang my hat on, especially with a wide receiver at the age of DeAndre Hopkins, with the speed of DeAndre Hopkins. Still, he's going to be able to be a productive option, but for fantasy purposes, I don't trust it on a consistent basis. So for now, this is where I leave him, number 35. Moving on to our number 36, we have Chris Godwin. Over the course of the last 3 games, Chris Godwin has been very underwhelming. He has put up performances of 2.6, 7.4, and 6.9. The opportunities are there in terms of 6, 7 targets per game, but we need a little bit more. Now, the reason why Chris Godwin has gotten himself a far less potential share of opportunity in terms of targets has to do with the upside that we have seen out of Rachaad White. 25 receptions in the last 5 games. And of course, Cade Otton has seen himself far more opportunity down in the red zone, which is taking away the upside that Chris Godwin had earlier this season. Therefore, he's at the very back end of the wide receiver 3 conversation. Moving on to our number 37, we have another one of these wide receiver options that has the potential. He's on the fringe because as of late, he has been injured. Again, in the last 2 games in which we saw Josh Downs only play 20 and 25% of the offensive snaps. Coming off of the bye week, hopefully he's fully healthy. If he gets a full, kind of reign of practice over the course of this entire week, there's no limitations. You got to remember that in the last 4 healthy games with Gardner Minshew, he's averaging 9 targets, 6 catches, 69 receiving yards, and a half a touchdown per game for 13.0 fantasy points per game, while also garnering a 22% target share within this offense in those last 4 healthy games. So as long as Josh Downs is healthy, he should probably be higher than number 37, but we'll be cautious with him considering we don't know his overall practice status going into this week. Again, it's only Wednesday. Moving on to our number 38, we have Demario Douglas. Demario Douglas in the last 4 games has been able to put up over 8 fantasy points on 3 different occasions, continues to see himself a high volume of overall targets considering, again, he is the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. With Devontae Parker returning off of this bye week, there may be a little bit less pressure put on Demario Douglas to make a play every single time down the field, but he is still going to be the number 1 receiving option in terms of total targets, considering he's the primary slot of this option who has found a lot of success over the course of the season. So going into this week, we still don't know who the primary QB1 is for this team. It could end up being Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi, Will Grier. Time will tell, but either way, Demario Douglas is going to get his opportunity. My number 39 for this week is Jordan Addison. As of late, hasn't seen a lot of opportunity within this offense now that Joshua Dobbs has been the starting quarterback. Again, we've seen a lot of rushing attempts from last week. The week prior was a lot of opportunities in the direction of TJ Hawkinson. That's probably going to be the case going forward, especially this week against Chicago Bears. They're probably going to try to establish the run, and when that doesn't work, they'll send the ball in the direction of TJ Hawkinson. If, in fact, Jordan Addison is to see himself a higher share or workload of potential opportunity, 10-plus targets, then, of course, he'll find himself a lot of fantasy success. But with a limited share of opportunity, we're not expecting much within the given week. Moving on to the final wide receiver of today's episode, we have Odell Beckham Jr. Again, the assumption is taking on the Los Angeles Chargers that we're going to see a lot of opportunity for these wide receivers to step up. Considering Odell Beckham Jr. has been able to score 10-plus fantasy points in each of the last 3 weeks, I would assume that they're going to get more and more opportunity going in his direction in the absence of Mark Andrews. Now, obviously, last time out, Thursday Night Football, he did end up hurting his shoulder. Hopefully, he'll be able to practice at a healthy rate this week. But like I mentioned with Zay Flowers earlier on in today's episode, in the last, 7 weeks, in which the Los Angeles Chargers have taken on opposing wide receivers, in the games in which they've taken on the Jets and the Chicago Bears. Again, offenses that don't have great quarterbacks. They played well as a defense and a secondary, but against the Dallas Cowboys, Kansas City Chiefs, Detroit Lions, Green Bay Packers, opposing wide receivers have been able to put up a base minimum of 175 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown per game. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, they've given up over 225 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers in the last 2 matchups. My expectation is a big week here, hopefully, for Odell Beckham Jr. as a primary receiving option within this offense that, of course, is going to need players to step up in the absence of Mark Andrews. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, tomorrow morning, I'll be live at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time prior to the Green Bay Packers taking on the Detroit Lions. Also, like I mentioned earlier, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit minimum of $10 to get my rankings tomorrow morning, to get them Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Those rankings just give you an indication as to who I would start, whether it is interpositional or flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings. And, of course, take advantage of the opportunity of checking out AndrewKirchhoffShop.com. All hoodies on the website are 25% off. Once you put the item within the cart, the automatic 25% discount is applied there. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Greatly appreciate the support. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.